In my mad quest to go over every Avengers comic that's ever been, today we're going to be talking about another Avengers writer named Roger Stern. Before we get into that, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more reviews of comics, new and old. The Avengers were in a rough spot in the early 1980s. This isn't me hand-wringing retroactively over bad comics from the far future. Jim Shooter's run up until issue 220 or so was widely controversial at the time it came out. Whatever popularity the team and series might have once enjoyed was gone, and suddenly a major tentpole in Marvel's roster of comics was vulnerable to losing its fanbase, all the while being mocked and derided by writers elsewhere in the industry, even within Marvel. Following Jim Shooter's time with the Avengers, writers like David Michelinie and Stephen Grant would fill in for a handful of issues. It felt like the series took a moment to take stock of itself, focusing a bit on new members She-Hulk and Tigra, while a new writer was sought out behind the scenes. Change was desperately needed, that much was clear, and the folks at Marvel sought out a writer who could offer a new start and direction to pull the series out of controversy that had plagued it since the 200th issue and the ongoing issues surrounding Hank Pym's character. That job ultimately went to Roger Stern. Stern is a bit different than a lot of the writers we've talked about so far. While most of them were relatively new and cut their teeth on the Avengers line early in their careers as comic book writers, with the exception of Stan Lee. At the time he took over the Avengers in the early 1980s, he had already been active since 1975, had been writing for a major Marvel character in the form of Spider-Man, and even worked as an editor for the Avengers series earlier. Right around the time he was creating the villain Hobgoblin, Stern was asked to take on the Avengers series. And luckily for the Avengers, he accepted the offer. I have to say, I was very relieved to find after over 100 issues of comics I just found so middling, or much worse. Roger Stern's Avengers is a breath of fresh air. These books hold up well, and right out of the gate, we need to talk about how great these comics look, with Stern largely working with John Buschema for the majority of his lengthy run. With Buscema's artwork and some excellent inking, we really get a sense of atmosphere and pacing that is absent in a lot of the older Avengers comics. Stern has a massively successful and long run and is responsible for the vast majority of Avengers comics that came out in the 1980s, starting at 227 and running all the way up to 287. In addition to the new members added to the team, Stern added one of his own characters and creations, Monica Rambeau, the then Captain Marvel, as a permanent fixture of the new team. Meanwhile, Star Fox, brother of Thanos, joined for a while and later was shuffled out for the likes of Namor and Dr. Druid. With so many issues and new characters written by Roger Stern, he covers a great deal of ground, a huge range of different stories and even different kinds of stories, and a big shift in his focus on these new characters. But we kept some of the old guard, and Wasp shifted to a new but well-deserved leadership role. Black Knight and Hercules, who had been around the Avengers series for some time, now took center stage. Aiding this massive shift in the roster was the creation of a new team created by Roger Stern called the West Coast Avengers. Collectively, the Avengers were built up in a way they hadn't been before. By having two teams, Stern could allow the Avengers series to focus on some newer and lesser developed characters, while mainstays took on a life of their own elsewhere. Thus, Stern was able to make the likes of the new Captain Marvel, She-Hulk, Hercules, and Wasp be the main focus throughout his run, leading to basically all these other characters becoming iconic members of the team with a huge legacy still warmly regarded by fans to this day. It was a cool and remarkably progressive shift for the Avengers, especially given that this is all taking place over the 80s, but one that Roger Stern not only enthusiastically embraced, but didn't ever really pat himself on the back within the context of his own stories. He just sort of put Wasp in charge and let a huge amount of focus shift towards Monica Rambeau as the resident newcomer superhero, and didn't really spend a lot of time congratulating himself for it. He just sort of kept writing Avengers stories, and that's the way to do it. It's really wonderful, and in hindsight is the best take on making the Avengers more progressive in the entire history of this team. It definitely helps that both of these women were very well written by Roger Stern, which is great because as the years went on, Monica would kind of grow into her role as an Avenger and ultimately be elected the new chairwoman of the team following Wasp's time in the role. Speaking of, Stern also did a borderline heroic job of basically salvaging the confusing mess that was the remnants of Hank Pym and Wasp's characters following the Jim Shooter era. While Roger Stern doesn't fix everything, nor does he magically make that dark time somehow go away, He walks back enough it certainly reduces the blunt blow of those terrible stories, at least somewhat holding Hank Pym accountable, vastly increasing Janet's legacy as she takes on more and more of a leadership role on the team. That stuff probably did a lot long term in saving Hank Pym's character from being discarded entirely once Scott Lang finally came along years later. In general, I like the way Stern focuses on fun character work so much that it really doesn't matter what stories and what villains or threat these characters are facing. It's just fun watching this team going about solving any problem and hanging out at their headquarters. But the good news is most of the actual Avengers stories and the threats they face around this time are also pretty well put together. The stories are fun too. You get stuff like Zeus or Vision taking over all computers on a planet in a well-meaning attempt to force world peace. A bunch of Marvel robots might team up to take on the Avengers, or maybe Spider-Man will show up for the story and once again try to join the team. You could really get anything from the Avengers at this time period, and I found the comics from this era were wonderfully unpredictable because of this. Stern also created a new home for the Avengers, a fun part of the team's history known as the Hydro Base, and it gave this era a distinct flair after the team had spent so much time in the Avengers Mansion after over 250 issues. Yet for all these changes to the roster, their home, and even the artwork, the general identity of the Avengers always remained the same. At the core of Roger Stern's run is two overriding elements: weirdness and stewardship. His books are weird, and that keeps them true to the core nature of pretty much every Avengers comic up until that point. So we do have a vastly different team than anything that had ever come before, yet it feels very distinctly of the Avengers aesthetic that by this point had been well established. And when I say weird, I do mean this in the best way possible. Stern's Avengers embraces every corner of Marvel, packing itself full of aliens, gods, and monsters from throughout Marvel's history, new and old. And that makes it very connected to not only the Avengers series that had come before it, but Marvel's by then well-explored and established shared universe. And yes, that does lead to moments of goofiness or campy silliness that does stand out relative to what was being published around this time in the 1980s throughout the industry. But it comes with a strong sense of sincerity. We really hadn't seen this series since Steve Englehart. If you go back and look at that review, I said the weirdness of Englehart's era was its best trait, and Roger Stern really brings that sense of weirdness back, but also really a strong sense of quality control that I feel Englehart and obviously Jim Shooter didn't carry. That gets into another second fundamental principle in Roger Stern's Avengers: stewardship. Stern can be seen as a sort of overseer of the Avengers at a time when Marvel Comics was fraught with change, and not always for the better. While the series was hardly resistant to the changes and cultural sensibilities of the 1980s, Roger Stern didn't let the Avengers become flush with the designs and sensibilities of the day. Instead, most of the characters take on a more timeless look, which helps them and makes these comics feel a lot less dated than they could be. Likewise, Stern didn't let the climate of the comics become darker and grittier, or spoil the more lighthearted fun of the Avengers' earlier days. These aspects of his writing I just described are what I like most about Roger Stern as an Avengers writer. He kept the series fun and fresh at a time when many comics were going in a darker direction that I don't think would have serviced these books. And he didn't do that easily either. This created conflict with various higher-ups at Marvel to the extent, after years of writing for the series, having essentially pulled the team from the brink and made them bigger and more successful than they ever were before, Roger Stern was suddenly and unceremoniously dropped by editor Mark Gruenwald. With all the nice things I've had to say about his run with the Avengers, this high grade shouldn't be a huge surprise to anyone. Yet another era falls just short of an elusive A+ that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby earned in their initial run. There are a couple of reasons for this. First, while I like most of the characters on Stern's Avengers, if there's a weak link, it's this guy, Star Fox. The whole idea of him being Thanos' brother, and otherwise being a bit of an outsider to the rest of the Avengers, does work in his favor, but in the history of new characters joining the Avengers, he ranks among the worst. So I don't like him very much in the Avengers, but he does have some fun moments in the series, like when Thanos shows up and teams up with the Avengers during the Secret Wars 2 event. That's an interesting change too, as increasingly these tie-ins would become a part of the Avengers series. In the case of Stern's era, it generally works in his favor, but it's also the reason he gets not an A+. And also serves as a bad omen for Marvel's increased dependency on these types of events. This is where that sort of thing starts, and it doesn't slow down in the future. In this era, the ties to the Avengers are pretty fun, for now, but that won't always be the case. Still, that story isn't amazing, but it's strong enough that in another weaker era of Avengers, it would actually have boosted its grade. Instead, it holds back Roger Stern's Avengers. That to me is not really a big statement of any weakness, but rather a statement of the tremendous strength of the overall run by Roger Stern. His Avengers were far from perfect, but the flaws that are there are very minimal, while it has so many cool strengths working in its favor. If you're looking for some solid Avengers books to check out, these issues come highly recommended by me, with few others ranking above them. It's a real shame that Roger Stern did end up getting fired because he paved the way for so much in the world of Avengers, but it did allow for a new writer named Walt Simonson to take over. Oh, I hope I said that name right, but I'll find out before I make the next video here on Grading the Avengers.